Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. There's a particular kind of silence that you get used to when you're deployed. It's the quiet between the deafening roar of a helicopter's rotors, the silence after the crack of a distant rifle, the heavy, waiting silence of a desert night. You learn to live in those spaces. You learn to trust the person watching your six. You learn that your entire world can shrink down to the few simple truths you hold on to get you through the day. For me, that truth was my wife, Lena. For 18 months, her face was the image I summoned in the dust and the heat. Her letters were the scripture I read by the dim light of a headlamp. Our shared dream was the map that would lead me home. The dream was simple: a small farm, a few acres of land back in the quiet hills of the state where we grew up. A place to wash the sand out of my soul for good, to grow something real from the earth with my own hands. It was a dream we were building, dollar by hard-earned dollar. Every paycheck I earned in that God-forsaken landscape, every cent of my combat pay, was wired directly into a joint account. It wasn't just a bank account, it was a testament, a symbol of our partnership, our absolute, unquestioning trust. I was the soldier on the front lines, and she was the guardian of our future, protecting the life we were going to build the moment I stepped off that transport plane. I trusted her with my money, my future, my life. You learn to trust in the silence, but you never expect the silence to betray you. The moment it happened was aggressively mundane. I was in the comms tent, a hot, noisy canvas box filled with the hum of servers and the static of a dozen conversations. It was my one chance of the week to connect with the outside world, to scroll through the same 3-day-old news headlines and read the emails that had piled up. I saw her name in my inbox, and a familiar warmth spread through my chest. But the subject line wasn't, "I miss you," or "thinking of you." It was 3 cold, sterile words: finalizing our separation. I thought it was a mistake, spam, a cruel joke. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked it open. The email was not a letter. There were no words of love or regret. It was a notification. It was written in the detached, efficient language of a corporate memo. She informed me that she had filed for divorce. She informed me that, as we had no children and our assets were shared, she had facilitated the division of our marital property by withdrawing the full balance of our joint account. She wrote that she had met someone, a man named Julian Thorne, a financial advisor who was helping her invest in a brighter, more secure future. She wished me the best and told me that her lawyer would be in touch with the official paperwork. And that was it. A decade of love, a lifetime of shared dreams, a future I was actively risking my life for, all of it terminated in a 4-paragraph email that read like a business transaction. My world didn't just crack, it atomized. The noise of the comms tent faded into a dull roar. The faces of my comrades became blurry, indistinct shapes. I was suddenly, completely, and utterly alone. A ghost trapped in a machine thousands of miles from a life that no longer existed. My first instinct was denial, then a frantic, desperate need to hear her voice, to hear her say it was a mistake. I practically ran from the tent, my hands shaking as I tried to get a signal on the satellite phone. The call went to a number that was no longer in service. She had changed her number. She had severed the last line. The finality of it was a physical blow. I spent my last few minutes of internet time logging into our bank's website. My hands were slick with sweat as I typed in the familiar password. The page loaded. Joint savings account. Balance $0. Every single penny. The money for the down payment on our farm. The money from Christmases spent in the desert. From birthdays missed. From the constant, grinding fear that is the daily bread of a soldier. All of it gone. She hadn't just left me. She had plundered the ruins. I walked out of the tent and into the blinding desert sun. I stood there for a long time, the sand and the silence stretching out in every direction. The men in my unit, good men, saw the look on my face and knew to leave me be. In that moment, I was more isolated than I had ever been in my life. I was trapped in a war zone on the other side of the world, with no home to return to, no money to my name, and a heart that had been surgically removed without anesthesia. The grief was a tsunami, a wave so vast it threatened to pull me under. But as I stood there, letting the brutal sun bake the tears from my face, something else began to surface. Something that every soldier learns to nurture: discipline. The grief was real, but it was a liability I could not afford. I had a job to do. I had men who depended on me. I could not break, not here. So I compartmentalized. I took the screaming, bleeding wound of my betrayal, and I locked it in a box in the back of my mind. I would deal with it later. The rage, however, the rage I kept. It was a cold, clean, efficient fuel. It sharpened my senses. It focused my mind. I still had 6 months left on my tour. 6 months to plan. 6 months to think. Lena and her new man, Julian, thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought they had robbed a man who was powerless to stop them. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that I am a master of reconnaissance, of strategy, of patience. They thought the war was over. They had no idea I was just beginning to plan my own. The next 6 months were the longest and yet the most focused of my life. On the outside, I was a model soldier. I was colder, yes, more distant, but my efficiency was undeniable. My commanding officer praised my focus. My men respected my quiet, unwavering calm in the face of chaos. They mistook my emotional disengagement for professional steel. They had no idea that every patrol, every briefing, every long, silent watch in the dead of night was a training exercise for a different kind of war. I was a man with a singular, all-consuming mission, and it had nothing to do with the conflict I was officially fighting. My real enemy was a ghost half a world away. I used every spare moment of my limited internet access to conduct reconnaissance. I became a digital archaeologist, digging through the layers of the life my wife was now living. Her social media, once a private space for friends and family, had been made public. It was a grotesque performance of her new life. There were pictures of her and Julian Thorne, a man with a smile as slick and artificial as a freshly printed dollar bill. They were in expensive restaurants, on weekend trips to wine country, in a new, sleekly furnished apartment that was a universe away from the cozy, cluttered home we had shared. It was a life paid for with my blood and sweat. I studied Julian Thorne with the intensity of a sniper studying his target. He was exactly what I expected, a boutique wealth manager with a flashy website and a portfolio of vague, impressive-sounding successes. He specialized in high-yield alternative investments. I knew the type. They were predators who used the language of finance to give their cons a veneer of legitimacy. He sold dreams, and he had found the perfect customer in my wife, a woman who had grown tired of waiting for our slow, humble dream to take root. Then, one night, scrolling through the digital wreckage of my marriage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a post from Lena, a picture of her signing a stack of papers at a polished mahogany desk. The caption read, "Securing our future, big things coming, thanks to my brilliant man." The papers. I zoomed in, my heart hammering against my ribs. I recognized the letterhead. It was from the law firm that had managed my grandfather's estate. And then I remembered, it wasn't just about the joint account. It was so much worse. Months before I deployed, in a moment of utter blind trust, I had signed a durable power of attorney over to Lena. At the time, it had seemed like a sensible precaution. If anything happened to me, she could manage my affairs. But it wasn't for our joint account. It was for a separate, much larger inheritance my grandfather had left me. A sum of money I had never touched, a sacred fund that was earmarked for one thing and one thing only: the final, outright purchase of our dream farm. It was a fortune I had kept completely separate from our daily lives. She had known about it, of course, and she had waited until I was trapped on the other side of the planet to make her move. She hadn't just emptied our savings, she had stolen my entire inheritance.
The initial shock was followed by a strange, icy calm. My grandfather had been a brilliant, deeply eccentric, and profoundly paranoid man. He had seen the world as a series of traps and had structured his life and his finances accordingly. He distrusted banks, and he distrusted smooth-talking men in expensive suits most of all. I remembered a long, rambling conversation with his lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a man as old and cantankerous as my grandfather had been. Abernathy had explained the structure of the inheritance. It wasn't in a simple bank account. It was a complex, multi-layered trust, a fortress of legal clauses, tripwires, and security protocols. It was a dragon's hoard, and Abernathy was the dragon. The power of attorney Lena possessed was a key, yes. It gave her the authority to request a full liquidation and transfer of the funds. But it did not give her the ability to execute it. My grandfather, in his infinite paranoia, had built in a final failsafe. Any transfer of that magnitude required a multi-stage verification process, culminating in a direct, voice-confirmed authorization from me, using a specific code phrase my grandfather had given me as a boy.
A phrase I had never shared with anyone, not even Lena. A cold, beautiful, and utterly ruthless plan began to form in my mind. Lena and Julian thought they had the money. They had initiated the transfer. They had seen the paperwork begin to move. They were likely living on credit, spending lavishly against the fortune they were sure was about to land in their account. They were celebrating their victory. But the money wasn't coming. It was frozen. It was sitting in a legal limbo, a massive, silent prize waiting for the one command that only I could give. And I would not deny the transfer. That would be too simple. It would warn them, alert them that something was wrong. No, my plan was far quieter and far more cruel. I would let them believe the money was on its way. I would let the bureaucratic delays, which I knew Mr. Abernathy would be masterful at creating, frustrate but ultimately not deter them. I would let them build their entire new life, their entire future, on the promise of a fortune that I and only I controlled. I would finish my tour. I would return home. And I would walk into their lives not as the broken-hearted victim they believed me to be, but as the silent, unseen architect of their ruin. They had emptied my account, but I held the key to their entire world. The war had changed. I was no longer on the defensive. I was about to launch a siege. My homecoming was the quietest I'd ever had. There were no balloons, no welcome home banners, no tearful reunions at the airport. There was just the quiet hum of the terminal and the profound, echoing emptiness of a life that had been stolen in my absence. I didn't go back to our house. I knew what I would find. I had seen the online listing. Motivated seller, it said. Instead, I rented a small, anonymous apartment in a part of the city where no one would know me. A gray, unremarkable place that suited my new, ghost-like existence. It was my forward operating base in my own hometown. My first act was to become invisible. I was a soldier trained in surveillance, and I put those skills to use. I observed them from a distance, a ghost watching the happy, oblivious couple who had destroyed my life. I saw them in their new, expensive car. I saw them coming out of a luxury high-rise apartment building where the rent was more than my entire monthly salary had been. I saw them dining at restaurants with wine lists that looked like ransom notes. They were living the high life, burning through money with a frantic celebratory energy. They were living on credit, borrowing against the phantom fortune they were convinced was just days away from arriving. They were so confident, so arrogant, so utterly unaware that their entire glittering world was a mirage, and that I was the one controlling the light. My second act was to meet with my general. I flew to the old, quiet town where Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather's lawyer, kept his dusty, wood-paneled office. He was exactly as I remembered, ancient, sharp as a shard of glass, and with a deep, abiding loyalty to my grandfather's memory. I sat across the desk from him, a soldier giving a battlefield report to his commanding officer. I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his gnarled fingers steepled, his eyes, behind thick spectacles, missing nothing. When I was finished, a slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "He always said the best defense was a well-designed trap." He confirmed everything my memory had told me. The trust was a legal fortress. The power of attorney was a key to a single gate, but beyond that gate lay a maze of security protocols. He told me he had been fielding increasingly frantic, then aggressive, then threatening calls from Julian Thorne's associates. He had been masterfully fending them off, using the bureaucratic equivalent of trench warfare, citing obscure bylaws, demanding notarized forms that didn't exist, claiming to be waiting on international banking clearances. He had created a masterpiece of delay, frustrating them to the point of madness, but never giving them a definitive no that would alert them to the truth. Together, in that quiet, sun-drenched office, we planned the final phase of the operation. We needed to move them from a state of frustration to one of euphoric confidence. We needed to bait the trap. "We will approve a small part of the transfer," Abernathy said, a predatory glint in his old eyes. "A taste, just enough to be intoxicating. We'll invent a legal justification, something about releasing an initial tranche for preliminary expenses while the larger sum clears international hurdles." It was brilliant. A small injection of real cash would validate all their hopes. It would silence their creditors. It would convince them that their victory was at hand. It would encourage them to double down, to sign a longer lease on the apartment, to buy the even more expensive car, to throw a lavish party to celebrate their genius. They would be so drunk on their success, they would never see the final blow coming. And the final blow was the most beautiful part of the plan. Abernathy explained a detail I had never known. My grandfather, in his infinite paranoia, had woven a poison pill into the trust's very core. Any attempt to liquidate the full amount through a power of attorney, especially by a third party like Julian, automatically triggered a silent internal audit. The trust was legally obligated to report any such activity as potential financial fraud and elder abuse to federal authorities. The transfer request Julian and Lena had signed wasn't just a request for money. It was a signed confession. By asking for the money, they had already set the legal mechanism of their own destruction into motion. All we had to do was let it run its course. The small transfer would be the bait. Their own greed would be the trap. And the full, unyielding weight of the federal justice system would be the executioner. We sent the wire transfer that afternoon, a small, tantalizing taste of the fortune they thought was theirs. Then, Mr. Abernathy made a quiet, confidential call to his contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office, forwarding them the full, damning file of Julian Thorne's attempts to liquidate my inheritance. The siege was over. The final assault was about to begin. All I had to do was choose the time and place of my reappearance, and I knew exactly where it would be. The bait worked even better than we had imagined. The small injection of cash sent Lena and Julian into a frenzy of self-congratulation. I watched from the digital shadows as their social media exploded with a new level of ostentatious celebration. There were pictures of a new sports car, of designer clothes, of reservations at restaurants so exclusive they didn't have prices on the menu. And then came the announcement I had been waiting for. They were hosting an investment victory party in their new apartment, a lavish affair to celebrate their financial genius and to welcome their friends into their new stratosphere of wealth. The date was set. My battlefield was chosen. The night of the party, I did not dress for revenge. I dressed like myself. I wore a simple, well-kept suit, the one I would have worn to take my wife out for an anniversary dinner. I was not there as a warrior. I was there as a ghost, a quiet, unavoidable truth they had forgotten existed. I walked into the lobby of their luxury high-rise and simply gave the concierge my name. I was not on the guest list, but my name, Alastair Hayes, still held a certain undeniable authority in this story. I was announced. I walked into their apartment, into the heart of their stolen kingdom.
The apartment was overflowing with the beautiful and the predatory. A room full of people like Julian, their smiles as sharp and fleeting as a flash of light on a knife's edge. And then I saw them. Lena was holding court, a champagne flute in her hand, a triumphant, brittle smile on her face. Julian was beside her, his arm possessively around her waist, playing the part of the magnanimous financial guru. My appearance was a silent, sonic boom in the middle of their party. The music did not stop, but the atmosphere shattered. Lena saw me first. The champagne flute trembled in her hand. The color drained from her face, her triumphant smile collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked like she had seen a ghost, which, in a way, she had. Julian's reaction was different. After the initial shock, his professional instincts kicked in. He saw me as a problem to be managed, an unexpected variable in his perfect equation. He strode towards me, his own smile a tight, false thing, his hand outstretched to steer me into a corner, to contain the threat. I did not let him. I walked past him, directly to Lena. "Hello, Lena," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over our small corner of the room. "You look well." She couldn't speak. She just stared at me, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the broke, defeated man she had left for dead with the calm, solid presence standing in front of her. "What are you doing here?" Julian finally hissed, grabbing my arm. I looked down at his soft, manicured hand on my sleeve and then back up at his face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "I believe this party is being funded by a joint investment," I said calmly. "I'm just the silent partner, here to see how my money is being spent." "Your money?" Julian scoffed, regaining a sliver of his arrogance. "You don't have any money. Lena and I are the success story here." "Are you?" I asked, a genuine, curious question. And then I laid it all out. I told them, my voice never rising above a conversational tone, about my grandfather's trust. I explained the security protocols, the voice authorization code, the legal fortress they had been trying to breach. I told them that the vast fortune they had been waiting for, the fortune they had built their entire life upon, was never coming. I told them that the small amount of money they did receive was not a victory, but a carefully placed piece of bait. And then I delivered the final, devastating blow. "You see, Julian," I said, looking directly at the slick, confident man whose world was visibly crumbling. "My grandfather had a clause in his will, a poison pill. Your very attempt to access that trust, using a power of attorney from a deployed soldier, automatically triggered a federal fraud investigation. I believe my lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, has already been cooperating fully with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your confession was the request you signed." I watched the last of his composure evaporate. I saw the pure animal terror in his eyes as he realized he had not just failed, but he had been masterfully and completely trapped. Lena finally found her voice. It was a desperate, horrified whisper. "The money, the police." "The money is secure," I said, looking at her, at the woman I had once loved, and feeling nothing but a profound, empty pity. "As for the police, I imagine they'll be in touch." I had not come to yell or to accuse. I had come to deliver a battlefield report. The war was over. I had won. I turned to leave. I had no interest in watching the fallout, the social implosion, the inevitable arrival of the authorities. My mission was accomplished. As I walked towards the door, I heard Lena cry out my name, a desperate, broken sound. I paused, but I did not turn around. My past was behind me. My future, the one I would build myself, was waiting. I used the real inheritance, my grandfather's legacy, to buy that small farm in the hills. The house is modest, the work is hard, but it is real. It is a foundation built not on greed or lies, but on the quiet, resilient earth. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I have my peace. I have my honor. I have restored my own life from the ashes of another. And some nights, in the perfect, peaceful silence, I think that's a victory my grandfather would have been proud of. My wife divorced me by email while I was deployed overseas and emptied our joint account. But I let her, because she thought she was robbing a bank, when all along she was just signing her own confession. Thanks for being here on Reddit Whispers. Sometimes the hardest stories carry the biggest lessons. What's the one lesson life forced you to learn the hard way? Share it below.